We've got two speakers today on the topic of the Occupied Palestinian Territories, and they're both going to speak for about 20 minutes each. We're going to have a break for Maghrib. Downstairs there's prayer facilities for those people who need to pray, and then we'll resume straight away after Maghrib for Q&A. So we should really be looking to get done for about 8:45 now. Can I kick off then, first of all, by introducing our first speaker. Amena to my right, Amena Saleem. She's a journalist. She's a strong campaigner for the organisation PSC, Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Her work really focuses on monitoring the media, and her specific focus and specialism is media monitoring in relation to BBC reporting. She also writes for an interesting website which is called the Electronic Intifada. And Amena has twice braved the sort of physical hazards of journeying by road to Gaza as part of the Viva Palestina convoy. So I'm sure she'll have some very interesting insight. And just by way of backdrop, some people had mentioned that the Palestinian issue was not necessarily something in the headlines or something which is particularly topical, especially with what's happening in places like Syria. And precisely because of that, I think we all felt it was a good reason to put the focus and the highlight back on Palestine, since it does seem to have been forgotten as a result of all of the other headlines around the world. So without further ado, welcome to Amena, and let me pass over to her.
Thank you very much. Yes, I work for Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and my media monitoring work does focus on the BBC. The reason for that is because we're all, if you own a television set, we're all paying for the BBC through the licence. There's no choice about it. And the way the BBC is set up, it's considered to be an independent organisation, therefore one that you can trust to be telling you the truth with accuracy and with impartiality. And people do trust it, and the BBC Media Centre in April last year released figures, and their own figures show that BBC News reaches 81% of the United Kingdom every week across all its platforms, so TV, radio, online. Its website, BBC Online, has more than 20 million UK browsers each week, and a Mori poll also conducted last year showed that the BBC was the news provider the public trusts the most. So you've got this news provider, it's got a huge reach, massive reach, reaching nearly all the UK population. It's hugely trusted, but it's putting out a great deal of misinformation about Palestine, about the occupation, and not just misinformation. It's just a total absence almost of news where it regards Palestinian suffering. And I wanted to just look first of all at how words are used by journalists to create this misinformation. And this isn't just the BBC, this is much of mainstream media. So we have, for example, the words conflict and dispute to describe what is in reality an aggressive occupation being carried out by a heavily armed nuclear power against a stateless and a refugee population. But if you ditch the word occupation, and if you use a word like conflict or dispute, those two words immediately create a barrier, and they are the barrier. And on one side of those words, you have the reality of what is happening to people in Palestine, and on the other side of those words, you have this image portrayed for you by the media. And in exactly the same way as the struggle for freedom in apartheid South Africa wasn't a conflict and it wasn't a dispute, and the struggle for equal rights in America, the civil rights movement, that wasn't a conflict, that wasn't a dispute. So the struggle for equality and justice in Palestine, equally, it's not a dispute, it's not a conflict. It's a struggle for freedom that is as great as any other struggle for freedom that has taken place in history, but it's not portrayed as such in the media. And again, you're looking at words, you'll have heard the words responded to or retaliated quite a lot, and those are used when the BBC and other media are describing Israeli attacks on Gaza. So Israel is never the aggressor, according to the BBC. It's always the victim. It's always defending itself. And when it drops its bombs, its white phosphorus missiles, drone attacks, whatever on Gaza, it's responding to Palestinian rockets. It's retaliating to rockets. And in this way, barriers to understanding the true situation are created, and misinformation is spread about what is actually going on there. So there's misinformation, and as I mentioned at the beginning, there's also absence. So for example, if you're depending on the mainstream media for your news, if you're watching the BBC or you're watching ITV, Sky News even, would you know that on March the 14th, little over 3 weeks ago, a 14-year-old boy, Yusuf, went out in his West Bank village. He went to pick thistles, edible thistles, for cooking. He went out at dawn. He went with two friends, aged 12 and 17, and they were ambushed by 6 Israeli soldiers wearing black hoods, who shot Yusuf in the back as he tried to run away from them, and in the hip. And he lay dying on the floor, and as he died, they abducted his friends, his 12-year-old and 17-year-old friends. They blindfolded them, they took them to a nearby, they handcuffed them as well, they took them to a nearby Israeli settlement, and they questioned them in Hebrew, which is the language that neither of them understands. And for failing to answer those questions in a language that isn't their language, they were beaten. Now, this wasn't reported anywhere on the BBC, which is the main news provider for this country. And when PSE wrote to the BBC to ask why, they wrote back and they said there's no mandate to report every killing. And yet you can imagine that if a 14-year-old Israeli child had been murdered by Palestinians either in a rocket attack or in the same manner that 14-year-old Yusuf was killed in, it would have been reported across the BBC, it would have been on news channels, it would have been on Radio 4, on the Today programme, headline news on BBC Online, and yet there was nothing on the BBC about Yusuf. Now, 4 days before he was killed, also in the West Bank, 18-year-old Sahdya was shot and killed as he tended his goats, and he was a university student studying media. Later that same day, a 23-year-old young man, Moeddin, was also killed as he sat in his car. The car was shot at. He again was, the Israeli army didn't allow an ambulance to come near him. He bled to death. There was nothing about those 3 killings which took place, 2 on March the 10th, 1 on March the 14th, on BBC News. And yet in that same time frame, between March the 10th and March the 14th, BBC Online carried report after report about rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel, which you may remember, and those reports are also on the Today programme, which is on Radio 4, and which the BBC promotes as its flagship news programme, which is meant to set the agenda for the rest of the day's news. So again, it's this combination of, there's an absence of Israeli killings of Palestinians, and then on the converse side, you have a lot of reporting about Palestinian attacks on Israel. And again, those attacks were reported, what the actual report was that then Israel had been dropping bombs, etc. Before that, it had been killing these Palestinians. None of that was reported. The Palestinians fired rockets, that was reported. And then as Israel continued bombing Gaza, that was reported as a response to those rockets. So you can see how the news works. And it will explain what I'm going to say next about a book which many of you may have heard of, which is called, the first edition was called Bad News from Israel, and the second edition, which came out 2 years ago, is called More Bad News from Israel, by 2 authors, Greg Philo and Mike Berry. They worked for the Glasgow Media Unit at Glasgow University. They carried out detailed research. They analysed over 200 news items on the BBC and on ITV, and they interviewed 800 people. And what they found from those interviews was that 80% of the people they spoke to thought that Israel was defending itself from Palestinian aggression, and also it was the Palestinians who were occupying Israeli land. And that is the impression that people, who aren't following this elsewhere like we do, who aren't, reading other websites, that's the impression that they're getting from BBC News. Now, in 2005, BBC governors, who were replaced later by the BBC Trust, they commissioned an independent report into BBC's coverage of what they termed the conflict. About it was like a report looking at the impartiality of that conflict, of that reporting, and what they found. It was published in 2006. It became known as the Thomas Report after its author, and it identified gaps in coverage as a shortcoming of the BBC. It also identified gaps in analysis, context and perspective in BBC coverage of the occupation. And the report concluded, to quote, "In short, we found that BBC output does not consistently give a full and fair account of the conflict. In some ways, the picture is incomplete and in that sense misleading." And the report also noted that the BBC failed to convey adequately the disparity in power between the two sides. So, in other words, that one is the occupier and the other is wholly occupied. And there's a complete asymmetry of power. So from that, they noted that much of BBC coverage of the occupation, therefore, to quote, is fundamentally misleading. And needless to say, that report, as soon as it came out, and the recommendations it suggested as well, was brushed under the carpet, and BBC reporting went on as before. And the other thing as well about Mike Berry's and Greg Filo's book, Bad News from Israel, is what they noted as well, that the gaps in public knowledge that they identified exactly mirror the gaps in BBC coverage. So when the BBC is not telling people that, for example, Gaza and the West Bank is occupied, which if you, just read BBC articles, it won't tell you that Gaza is occupied, it won't tell you it's under siege, it won't tell you Israel is the occupying power with responsibility for that territory. And so people aren't aware of this, and they do just see Gaza as this terrorist enclave, and all they're doing is firing rockets. And a couple of recent articles which illustrate that. There was one online article it was by a journalist called Yolandi Nell, and it was published in November 2013, so about 4 months ago, and it looked at the 12-month period between the signing of the ceasefire agreement between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza in November 2012, following Israel's 8-day assault on Gaza. There was a ceasefire agreement was signed, and so she looked at the 12 months between November 2012 and November 2013. And in that article, she spoke about how many rockets have been fired out of Gaza into Israel. She spoke about these terror tunnels that Hamas was allegedly digging. She quoted Israeli army commanders as saying, we fear they're digging these tunnels to attack Israeli civilians. She talked about the tunnels being used to smuggle arms into Gaza. But at no point in that article did she mention, A, that Israel had breached the ceasefire agreement just 2 days after it had been signed, and she didn't mention that Israel had breached the ceasefire at all. There was no mention of Israeli attacks on Gaza in this incredibly long article, and there was absolutely no mention that during the time period she was analysing, Israel had killed 10 Palestinians in Gaza. So while she went on and on and on about rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel, about quoting this Israeli commander about how they were on the alert for more terror attacks, how scared Israeli civilians were, there was no mention of actual, all supposition by the way, no mention of the actual facts that in that period Palestinians were being killed at the rate of almost one a month. So again, we wrote to the BBC, they put a line in to say, it basically said Palestinians claim that Israel has also breached the ceasefire. So it's a Palestinian claim, it's not fact. And yet, the facts are there, the BBC wants them. But when we wrote back and said, but what about these 10 Palestinians that Israel has killed in this period? How can your report be complete? How can it claim to be an analysis of that 12 months when you're not mentioning these Israeli killings? And they wrote back, and we said, it's biased, it's not impartial, it's not accurate. And they wrote back and they said, impartiality doesn't depend on an exact equivalence in reporting. So this is what you're putting up with, you know, with the BBC. This is what you're fighting against all the time. And I'll give you some more examples of things the BBC has come back to us with. A couple of years ago, you may remember BBC Radio 1 Extra invited a rapper, Mike Righteous, onto its programme. It's a hip-hop music programme. And he came on and he basically did a freestyle, which means he kind of made up this rap as he went along. And during his rap, he was talking about the price of fame, how, you know, you can no longer be who you are. And he said, despite being famous, I can still scream free Palestine for my pride. And those words, the word Palestine, was censored out when it was actually played. So it said, I can still scream free, and then there was just like the sound of breaking glass, and then the rap came back on. So they wouldn't even play the word Palestine on a radio programme. So again, we went through an 8-month correspondence with the BBC, trying to find out what was going on, what were their reasons for censoring the very word Palestine. And they wrote back, I'll tell you what the head of BBC Audio told us. Originally he told us that using the word Palestine might be offensive to some people, and that's why they've censored it out. So we wrote back and we said, can you tell us exactly who will find the word Palestine offensive? You know, a few weeks went back, we wrote again. We got a reply from him. He changed his mind. Paul Smith said, we did not edit out the word Palestine because it was offensive. Referencing Palestine is fine, but implying that it is not free is the contentious issue. So they have the BBC actually denying the occupation in writing. And this is a news organisation. You know, it's a news organisation allegedly committed to journalistic values of truth and accuracy and impartiality. And in the Royal Charter, which accompanies the BBC agreement, which is what it signs with government, whereby the government gives it our money, our licence fee money, and also additional taxpayer money. It signed this agreement, and in that agreement it has agreed to be impartial and accurate, and yet here we have the proof that it's not being so. I'll give you a couple more examples. One of the things that we regularly write to the BBC about is when they cover the settlements, the illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which you know, are the subject of UN resolutions, who call them illegal. You know, the UN resolution says that settlements are the biggest obstacle to peace in the Middle East, and they have no legal validity. And this is a view accepted by the UK government, which is funding the BBC. It's also accepted by you know, the US government, which is the biggest funder of Israel. And yet the BBC can't accept that the settlements are illegal. So it always says they are deemed illegal under international law, and then adds a right that Israel disputes this. So we've written and said, why don't you just say that the settlements are illegal under international law? And Darr, who was BBC Middle East Online's news editor at the time, he wrote back and he said, we feel that to simply state that the settlements are illegal under international law is potentially misleading. An untutored reader might wonder why, if Israel is so flagrantly breaking the law, such a criminal state is still a member of the United Nations, a favoured ally of the United States, a major trading partner of the EU, and so on. So basically what they're saying is that people don't know what's going on. We're not going to tell them. We don't want to confuse them by making them think Israel's a criminal state. So we're just going to obfuscate on their criminality and not point it out as a clear fact. Because if we pointed it out as a clear fact, they'd be very, very confused. And of course, the reason they're confused and might wonder why you know, such a criminal state is a member of the United Nations, etc., it's because news organisations like the BBC aren't telling them. And because I've only got about 3 minutes left, is that right?
Yeah, we're going to break after you for others.
Okay, yeah. I'll just give you one more example of how the BBC is totally misleading the public on Palestine, on the occupation, and is favouring the Israeli point of view, the Israeli narrative, the Israeli propaganda line over international law and over fact. And that's over the question of the status of Jerusalem, which is a divided city. There's West Jerusalem, there's East Jerusalem. Israel occupies East Jerusalem. It annexed it in 1967. The occupation and the annexation is considered illegal under international law. Again, UN Resolution 242 calls for the withdrawal of Israel from East Jerusalem, and the international community does not recognise the annexation, and it only recognises Israel's de facto rule of West Jerusalem, which means just as a fact on the ground rather than as in law. So so a responsible news organisation, therefore, when it's reporting, make a distinction when it's reporting between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem. The BBC, however, continually refers to Jerusalem in its entirety as an Israeli city. So we have that in its online, its country has profiles for countries, calls on country pages. So for Israel, the seat of government is listed as Jerusalem, not West Jerusalem. And you'll hear that when you're listening and it's reporting on TV and on radio. So basically it's putting forward what the Israelis want to put forward, that Jerusalem belongs to Israel. It's an Israeli propaganda line. It wants journalists to believe that line and then to convey the lie to their audiences. And the BBC is willingly doing that for them. So again, when negotiations come up, when the Palestinians say, East Jerusalem, we want that to be the capital of our future state, again, people are going to think, but it's Israeli, look at these Palestinians, all they want the whole time is Israeli land. And that's how people, are under the impression that it's Palestine occupying Israel. So PSC, we've written to the BBC again and again, we've said, why are you referring to Jerusalem as Israeli? International law says it's not. The BBC Trust sent us this response. They had their senior editorial advisor, Liane Bakul, look at it. And they said the advisor, Liane Bakul, acknowledged that Israel's sovereignty over the whole of Jerusalem was not recognised under international law. However, she considered that Israel had de facto control over the entire city in a political, administrative and military sense. She also noted that Jerusalem was administered as a single entity by the Jerusalem Municipal Authority, which made no distinction between East and West, and that is why we can continue to refer to it as Israeli, notwithstanding international law. So there you have it, notwithstanding international law, the BBC will continue to push the Israeli line and accept Israel's creation of illegal facts on the ground, and that is why PSC is challenging the BBC over and over again to report accurately and honestly, without bias. It's it's a slog, but it has to be done. And if you want to take part in any of this, I run the Fair News campaign. I have volunteers. They work in their own time from home. They monitor certain programs. They let me know what's being reported. I send out emails to volunteers saying this and this needs a complaint sent in. Please send in a complaint. They send in their complaints. The BBC replies, and this is how we keep going. And we have had complaints upheld by the trust. Things have been changed. And what we're trying to do is make the Palestinian voice, not just the pro-occupation, the Zionist voice, heard within the BBC. So if you want to help in that, please come and see me afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Amena, for very insightful and well-researched, informative speech there. We're gonna take a short break for Maghrib, but let me just quickly whet your appetite for the next session by introducing the next speaker on the panel, and that's Sahdya Darr. Sahdya has a very interesting past. Certainly, she knows no fear. She only started off her career at the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development in Kabul, in Afghanistan. She then went on to work with the UK government's Stabilisation Unit after her MSc in Globalisation and Development. More recently and currently, she's played a very active and interesting part, and I'll refer to my notes for this title, acting as a human rights observer in the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme, and she'll have to explain to us what that means. in Israel and Palestine, where she's recently returned. And what's going to be particularly interesting is she's got with her some very interesting photographs and a presentation which summarises a lot of what she observed, so we can get a much more visual context to the current update that's being offered. After her presentation, we'll open up to the panel, and hopefully we'll have some very interesting and provocative Q&As. So
I'm going to be delivering to you a presentation about my work in the Occupied Palestinian Territories and introducing to you some of the people I met and sharing their stories of how the occupation in the OPT affects their daily lives. Last year, from August until November, I served as a human rights observer with the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel, EAPPI. The EAPPI is an initiative of the World Council of Churches, WCC, who responded to the call by local churches in Jerusalem in 2001 to stand in solidarity with the churches and people in Palestine. The EAPPI has been running since 2002, bringing internationals to the OPT to serve as human rights observers, where they work with many different people, local people and organisations in numerous locations. So, if I just give you some kind of background as to the kinds of things my team and I were doing out there, human rights observers carry out a number of tasks that depend on where they are serving, but in general, the responsibilities of human rights observers are to provide a protective presence, so for example, accompanying children to school, monitoring and reporting human rights abuses. For example, we documented human rights abuses by taking photos, videos, and collecting testimonies, so listening to people's stories, and also writing reports which we submitted each week to the UN agencies, UNICEF, UN OCHA, and also ICRC. We also support Palestinians and Israelis who are working together for peace by participating in the daily life and work of Palestinian and Israeli civil society, and meeting and learning from the experiences of Israeli peace activists in Jerusalem, Haifa, and Sderot, and campaign for a just and peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by engaging with the media locally, nationally, and internationally, and before, during, and after our time in the field, and being a part of international advocacy and networking activities that highlight the human rights situation in the OPT. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to begin by introducing you to Khalil Arqoub and his children Adam and Jannah. And here is Khalil with his staff and pupils. I know them all from my time providing protective presence to them every Wednesday morning. Here is the school. The first time we visited at Nabi Samuel's school, Khalil was beaming, and I can still remember the smile on his face. The new school year had started, and the staff and pupils were full of energy and excitement. It was after Khalil told us what it was like being the principal of Nabi Samuel School that we really understood why everyone was so ecstatic. This is what Nabi Samuel School looked like before we arrived. Previously, the school was comprised of one building, the building that you see here, which served as a classroom, storeroom, and the principal's office. During our first conversation with Khalil, he explained to us why everyone was so happy. The pictures that you saw previously, the school had received new turf, new playground equipment from the Jordan River Foundation, JRF, and 2 new classrooms were on their way. He told us about his plans to paint the walls of the playground with cartoon characters and went on to tell us what this meant to him, his staff, and his pupils. The donations by the JRF have transformed the school. They have not only changed the aesthetics of the school, but have created a different atmosphere and significantly impacted upon teaching and learning. So, Navi Samuel School is located in Area C of the West Bank, which is controlled by the Israeli military. The school faces two major problems. The first is that the village of Navi Samuel lies on the Jerusalem side of the separation barrier in the OPT, and therefore both staff and pupils find it difficult to access the school. Secondly, the school has received demolition orders on the school's small outside toilet and a tent they've been using as an extra classroom because they were built without permits. Under the Oslo Accords, Israel retains military authority and full control over building and planning permission in Area C, and responsibility for the provision of services falls to the Palestinian Authority. However, because of the separation barrier, the PA can't access the area. Whilst we were there, the school received a visit from the Israeli Civil Administration inquiring as to where the school had received its new playground equipment, turf from. And they were told to make sure that they took good care of it. And Halil had told us that he thought this was quite sinister. And funnily enough, two weeks later, just before we left, the school were issued with a stop work order, which means they're not allowed to put the two new classrooms that are on their way will either have to be returned, or knowing Halil, he's very, I think he'll make sure that they stay there somehow. Okay, some facts about demolitions. Demolitions are one of the key humanitarian concerns identified by UN OCHA. It's not only homes that are demolished, but also animal shelters and bread ovens, so people's livelihoods are also destroyed. The lack of an appropriate planning and zoning system in Area C means that most Palestinians cannot obtain permits for construction or rehabilitation of homes, animal shelters or essential infrastructures, and only 1% of Area C has been planned for Palestinian development. Homes built without permits are routinely demolished and families forcibly evicted. So it's virtually impossible for Palestinians to obtain permits to build, as Palestinian construction is heavily restricted. According to the Israeli Committee Against Demolitions, ICAD, 94% of Palestinian permit applications are denied. And given the inability to obtain building permits, many Palestinians no longer apply and instead build them without a permit in order to meet their needs, despite the ever-present risk of demolition. And most of the demolitions that occur happen in Area C of the West Bank, which means that the Palestinians living in Area C are among the most vulnerable. I apologise for this map, but I'll explain to you. So I don't think you'll be able to see clearly, but the graph on the left-hand side shows the number of demolitions, and they've actually risen dramatically from 2010 to 2011, as did the number of displaced people. And on the map, the purple circles, the larger ones with I think it's perhaps a white dot inside of them, they show that large numbers of people have been displaced throughout the West Bank, particularly in and around East Jerusalem. Just before I came back at the end of November, and the new team went out at the end of November, and I think in the first month they were called to 5 demolitions in Beit Hanina and around that area in East Jerusalem. So here is a demolition that I witnessed in the town of Abu Dis. My team and we arrived to this, and we were told that rubber bullets and live ammunition had been fired by the young Palestinian boys who were on the street, and also that tear gas had been thrown. Clashes between the young men of Abu Dis and the Israeli military have been going on since the day before, when the military came into Abu Dis to demolish the home. The feelings that the demolitions arouse manifest themselves in a number of ways. When we arrived in Abu Dis, rubber bullets and live ammunition were strewn across the ground, and the young boys on the streets were firing slingshots. So we went away for an hour because we weren't allowed anywhere near the demolition, but when we came back, we spoke with some of the people from Abu Dis to begin documenting what was happening. And when we returned, this is what we returned to. These are what I picked up from the road that you saw on the previous slide. The Israeli military, they often deny using live ammunition, but these were all over the road, and I took a photo of these to include in our documentation of the demolition and what had been going on. So So these photos were taken by my colleagues who were called to the Palestinian village of Az-Zayam as demolitions were taking place. Demolitions lead to the displacement of Palestinian families and have wide-ranging physical and psychological impacts. Children are frequently disproportionately affected by the demolition of their homes and the subsequent displacement of their families. According to a study conducted by Save the Children UK and the Welfare Association, children are separated from their parents and face gaps in access to education, health facilities, and clean water in the immediate aftermath of a house demolition. They also found that emotional and behavioural problems persist beyond the first 6-month period following a demolition, and these long-term effects include lower academic achievement rates, early school dropout, and then, in addition, the symptoms of a psychological distress found among children include an increase in aggression, depression, difficulty concentrating, and bedwetting. Also in this survey, it was revealed that only 12% of surveyed families reported that they'd had the chance to empty the house of its contents prior to demolition, and quite often people whose homes are demolished end up paying for the Israeli military demolishing their home, so they receive a bill afterwards. Demolitions frequently result in disruption of livelihoods, as I mentioned earlier, which reduce in the standard of living and limited access to basic services. So that was the end of my first story and one of the responsibilities I had whilst I was out there. I'm going to move on to the second one, which is the monitoring and reporting on Kalandia checkpoint. So this is Nazir. He arrived at Kalandia checkpoint one morning with his wife just before we were due to finish monitoring the checkpoint at 7:30 a.m. He was crossing through Kalandia checkpoint into East Jerusalem to attend a hospital appointment. His wife was carrying their bags while Nazir walked with the support of his Zimmer frame, which you can see in the picture. And they walked to the humanitarian lane, which they were hoping to pass through, as Nazir would not have been able to walk through the lane that's usually used, as it's too narrow. Just some background on Kalandia. Kalandia emerged in late 2001 on what used to be Jerusalem Airport and then Atarot Airport when the Israelis renamed it, and it's situated on the main Ramallah-Jerusalem road. The checkpoints are operated by the Israeli police, soldiers and private security contractors. And as humanitarian observers, we observed Kalandia checkpoint every Tuesday, Thursday and Sunday mornings from 4:30 a.m. until 7:30 a.m, counting the number of Palestinian men, women and children that passed through the checkpoint at this time. And we also conducted spot checks to find out the average waiting time to pass through the checkpoint and assisted with those who had been turned back, and logged whether or not the humanitarian lane was opened on time, as well as intervening on behalf of Palestinians to negotiate with Israeli police, soldiers and private security contractors. We noticed that Nazir and his wife had been waiting for a few minutes for someone to come and check their documents and then open the humanitarian lane so that they could pass through. So the humanitarian lane is for the elderly, sick, women and children to use, and is supposed to open at 6 a.m. every morning. However, more often than not, this would not be open at 6 a.m. and when we used to ask private security contractors or soldiers why it was not open, they would tell us that they weren't allowed to open it because only the Israeli police were allowed, or that they couldn't find the key, but then they miraculously find the key 5 minutes later. As there were no police, private security contractors or soldiers in the area, we tried to get the attention of the soldier sitting in the booth who was operating the turnstiles. And he opened the door and explained that Nazir and his wife, we explained to him that Nazir and his wife needed to pass through the humanitarian lane, as they wouldn't be able to pass through the usual lanes with his Zimmer frame. We were told that there was only him in the booth and he wasn't allowed to leave it. There was nothing he could do, and we asked him how Nazir was expected to pass through this. He went back into the booth, and my colleagues and I had to assist Nazir and his wife through this lane. We took their bags whilst his wife tried to get the Zimmer frame through. Nazir had to walk down the lane without his Zimmer frame, clutching onto the bars to support him while he did, and I remember thinking just how humiliating this was. So almost every morning that we arrived to monitor the Kalandia checkpoint, there would be queues in the car park going into the car park, and at the other side, when the men had passed through, they would congregate to pray Fajr, the morning prayer, and sometimes wait around until work started, because often they would be leaving their homes, coming through at 4:30 in the morning to get to work for perhaps 9 o'clock. But I'll explain in the next slide, to account obviously for waiting times in the queues and whether they might be turned back. The checkpoints affect each and every Palestinian in the OPT. The arduous journeys to the checkpoints, the long hours of waiting, the time and energy wasted, and the arguments and altercations with soldiers. This is the daily reality for Palestinians passing through not only Kalandia but other checkpoints too. So this was a common sight when we used to turn up to the checkpoint on Tuesday, Thursday and Sunday mornings. A service full of Palestinian men being dropped off at Kalandia checkpoint before the crack of dawn at 4:15 a.m. on their way to work in East Jerusalem. One of my first thoughts back home in the UK was that there are times when my alarm would go off for work in the morning and I would press snooze, and an extra 5 or 10 minutes never really makes much of a difference. But for these Palestinian men, women and children that pass through this checkpoint every day, 5 or 10 minutes makes every difference. People's lives are dictated by the checkpoint. They have to consider getting to the checkpoint, how long it will take them to pass through because of the queues, if the lanes are shut, and even that they might be turned back once they get to the booth where the documents are checked. Palestinians holding West Bank IDs require entry permits to enter into East Jerusalem and are limited to using 4 of the 16 checkpoints along the separation barrier. Permits are usually sought for work and to attend doctor and hospital appointments. They are less frequently sought for religious worship, i.e. to attend Al-Aqsa Mosque on Fridays for Jummah prayer, as it is very uncommon for males below the age of 45 to be allowed to pass through the checkpoint on Fridays. Shortly before we left, the team that took over from us have started now monitoring Kalandia checkpoint on Fridays around Jummah time. So between 4:30 a.m. and 7:30 a.m., the number of Palestinian men, women and children passing through Kalandia checkpoint, our figures that we counted, were around 2,000 to 3,000. So as the occupying power, Israel is responsible for the welfare of the Palestinian population under its control and for ensuring that they are able to exercise their basic human rights. While Israel is allowed under international law to restrict the right to freedom of movement of Palestinians to address legitimate security needs, it can do so only to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation in a non-discriminatory manner and taking into account other legal obligations. So, the Israeli government's position is that the separation barrier and checkpoints within it provide security for Israel and its citizens, and they cite the decrease in the number of suicide attacks as evidence that the separation barriers and checkpoints have worked. However, this is debatable because if you really want to get through, you can. The wall is not actually a wall all the way through. There are holes and fences, and where we actually lived, which was next to the wall, we often saw people every evening with ladders trying to climb over. And I was also told by one of the private security contractors that he frequently saw people climbing over when he finished work. Another argument that is made by the Israeli government is that the separation barrier protects Israelis living in the West Bank. However, the Israelis are living in settlements, which, as I said, they're illegal under international law. The settlers should not be there in the first place, and actually the unsafe thing to do is to put your own civilian population in the middle of your neighbour's land, which you are occupying, and whose people you are oppressing. So just before I finish, I wanted to introduce you, because I mentioned in the beginning that we also, EAPPI also works with Israeli peace activists. So these are two of the people that we worked with. The first is Avner Gevaru, and he works for an organisation called Breaking the Silence. Breaking the Silence, Avner, is a former soldier, and Breaking the Silence is an organisation of veteran combatants who served in the Israeli military since the start of the Second Intifada, and they've now taken it upon themselves to expose the Israeli public to the reality of everyday life in the occupied territories. So they organise tours, and they take people from internationals who are visiting, and also Israelis who are, well, there are any that are curious and want to know, they take them on this tour. And the second person that you see, Hannah Barag, she's the founder of Maxum Watch. Maxum means checkpoint in Hebrew. Her organisation is a movement of Israeli women, peace activists from all sectors of Israeli society who oppose the Israeli occupation and denial of Palestinians' rights to move freely in their land. We often saw them when we were monitoring Kalandia checkpoint. And lastly, what you can do. If you want to hear my voice, I can. I'll go through it quickly. So you can tell someone what you learnt at this talk. I went there for 3.5 months, and there's always things that I'm learning. You visit Israel and Palestine for yourself, monitor the media to keep informed about the situation, particularly specialist news sources, help end trade with illegal settlements, write to your elected representative, MP or MEP, become an ecumenical accompanier, in other words, a human rights observer, and donate to APBI.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm sure all of you will agree with me that was a very courageous as well as incredibly effective use of time in the occupied territories. And I mean, anybody who has been there will realise what Sahdya has done is not easy at all. It's actually putting yourself physically in the line of fire because on so many occasions, especially the very young Israeli soldiers, I don't like to use the term defence force, more of an attack force, but they simply do not respect even international observers or human rights workers. In fact, they see them as a personal threat, and will often actually target specifically those people who are coming in as observers. So once again, I really commend Sahdya's work, and hopefully that encourages a lot of us to follow suit because it makes such a big difference with people on the ground. Anyway, we'll go straight into Q&As. You've got two very different perspectives there. Amena, as you remember, focused very much on the media perceptions of the Palestinian, the word conflict being used, and she also spoke specifically about the responsibilities of our own media, namely the BBC, and its failings in representing fairly the plight of the Palestinians. And then obviously more recently we've really heard about day-to-day life of what it actually feels like to be under occupation and what that means practically for people on the ground. So who wants to kick off? Lady at the front.
Hi, it's just a question for you. When you say visiting Palestine, Israel, doesn't going there, spending money there, doesn't mean that your money actually is going to the Israeli state?
I mean that when you go there, for example, like whilst I was out there, I had my friend Catherine, who's in the audience, came to visit me for 5 days, and my sister actually also came to visit me, and neither of them, I wouldn't say they don't know anything about the situation, but it was definitely an eye-opener to them to see those things for yourself. Like, for example, my friend Catherine came to stay with me for a few days, and we had to cross through Kalandia checkpoint. I think I do understand where you're coming from, but I think it's really important to not just, if you can and you're able to try and go and see what life is like, because I came away with some of my views were challenged.
Sorry, there's another aspect to your question. Specifically to the charity you work for, does it base itself on a two-state solution?
I don't work for this charity, by the way. I was volunteering with them, and they do advocate a two-state solution.
I mean, do you have anything else to contribute?
I just say that if you're going to the West Bank, you won't be contributing financially to the Israeli occupation, because you'll be, shopping in Palestinian shops and cafes, etc., that kind of thing. You might pass, if you fly to Tel Aviv to go to the West Bank, you'll pass through, but you won't, unless you want to, you won't be stopping in Israel itself.
Question in the middle there.
Just a question for the lady on the left and a question for the lady on the right. First of all, the lady on the left. In terms of disproportionate reporting by the BBC, are you able to comment on any disproportionate reporting by Channel 4 and ITV compared to the BBC? And secondly, you encourage complaints to the media. Over, say, the last 5 or 10 years, has there been a significant change in the narrative coming out of the BBC, for example, on the issue of Israel and Palestine? And the question to the lady on the right, I'm terrible with names, sorry. Sahdya. Your last slide showed a list of what we could do. Are you able to comment on the effectiveness of BDS, boycott, divestments and sanctions, on the situation in the West Bank, and whether or not that's had a significant impact?
Well, in terms of how ITV and Channel 4 report, ITV a lot of the time kind of just ignores Palestine even exists. So, which isn't a good situation either. The most recent report I can think of they did was absolutely hideous, and it was by their chief foreign correspondent, and it was headlined, I can't remember it was something, Gaza's, Israel uncovers terror tunnels, and this was an ITN, it was their New September report, and it was also online, and it was all based on Israeli army sources. They interviewed a couple of Israeli army spokespeople and also the US ambassador to Israel, and they claim they found this mile-long tunnel leading from Gaza into Israel, which they then claimed was going to be used to launch what they call terror attacks on Israeli civilians. The Palestinians denied it was theirs, but that wasn't put into this report. And again, the question was, and they filmed, they let the reporter down into that tunnel to have a look at it and film it. And it was this incredibly constructed, concrete tunnel with wooden flooring. How the Palestinians could have constructed it is anyone's guess. So obviously, very, very biased report, nothing at all in that, no Palestinian spokespeople, nothing in that report about, again, how Gaza is occupied, under siege, sealed off, and has used tunnels from Egypt into Gaza for 6 years as a lifeline, bringing food, medicines, fuel, and other essentials. So again, one-sided, purely speculative. Army says, we've discovered this tunnel, it was built by the Palestinians. Was it, wasn't it, who knows? No proper investigative journalism carried out. Channel 4 is, it's different, and it has produced some really good reports. And an example of how it contrasts with the BBC, in February, the week of February the 14th, the BBC had this report on Radio 4 from our own correspondent, Simon Cox, the journalist. He'd spent some time in Gaza. Radio report, Kate Adie introduced it, and the headline was, "Come to sunny Gaza!" ! With Simon Cox saying, "Oh, I went there, it wasn't that bad, it wasn't frightening at all, and they were having a great time, and I'd go back with my family for a holiday," and it was utterly ridiculous. So many things missed out. Again, the whole fact it's under siege occupation. He described looking out of his hotel window, and he described this golden curve of sand and the Mediterranean Sea lapping at the beach. He would have seen Israeli warships and gunships on the horizon, but he didn't describe them. He would have seen and heard constantly Israeli drones in the sky, but there was no description of this. He described how plush this hotel was, but he didn't say that he wouldn't have been able to drink water from the tap because 95% of water in Gaza is undrinkable. So it's utterly ridiculous. That's the BBC, and there was an online report to accompany it. 3 days later on Channel 4 on February 17th, and the next day on February 18th on Channel 4 News, they ran 2 reports by their chief foreign correspondent. He was also in Gaza, and he reported, the story was completely different. The first one, it was about a Gaza's current food champion who was also a builder. He'd fallen off the roof, he'd broken his back. It was a tragic story. He could no longer provide for his family, and the family were basically starving. There wasn't food in their fridge, their house wasn't fixed up, and through that family story he told the story of Gaza as a whole, and the story was about resilience, it was about courage. The thing, when we wrote to BBC, that's what they claimed Simon Cox's report was about, but his report had no context, no background. And then you had this Channel 4 report, which really showed the situation in Gaza, how desperate it was for families under siege, and how they were coping with it. And the next day, His story was about a 4-year-old boy, Abdul Karim, with a brain, 3-year-old actually, with a brain tumour. He needs radiotherapy and chemotherapy. It can't be provided in Gaza because, again, the siege prevents the right drugs from coming through. He needs to go abroad to get that treatment. The Israeli government had given a permit to him to travel, but not to his parents, so he can't go. And again, it was a report about this child, and through that child's story, what he brought to everyone's attention watching it was that how Israel denies, drugs to Gaza, medicines, hospital equipment, the electricity to run things like dialysis machines, etc. So again, it was a story about courage and resilience in Gaza, but you knew exactly, it gave a true and accurate picture of the situation. So I think those contrasting reports shows the difference between BBC reporting, where if you listen to it from our own correspondent, you have no idea what was going on, that there was even a siege on. But if you watch Channel 4 News, 3 days later, you'd be shocked and horrified, and you'd think, well, who's telling the truth? I've got 2 totally different reports here on Gaza. One that it's a lovely sunny place you can go on holiday, whereas actually you can't even get in. As a fan, he got in because he was a journalist, and a totally different one. Was there another part of that?
What have complaints achieved?
Well, we've had reports, we've had online reports changed, we've had the Trust uphold our complaints about broadcast programmes, and when a complaint is upheld, the journalists, producers and editors across the board are spoken to and have to make sure that in future the chain, what they did wrong, they don't do it again, so it impacts on editorial decisions. So it is important to make those complaints, because if they are upheld, they will change editorial policy.
Sahdya, boycott.
Well, you mentioned BDS. Whilst I was there, I think it's very difficult because you get caught up in the daily realities of the occupation, so people's everyday struggles. So it's kind of hard sometimes to see that with something that's a bit wider, like a wider kind of big movement. But I have been following it a bit since I've come back, and obviously it's gaining a lot of momentum. And I think obviously it's really important to read your specialist international news sources. I'm reading Haaretz, and commentators in Haaretz have said that even Israel is getting worried now because of the momentum that it's gaining across educational institutions. So I think, as well as, I know that everyday struggle is going on, but you do need that international movement and support.
Question right at the back.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was particularly interested in what you said about the BBC, because it was precisely the reason for that made me leave the BBC. And when I was covering the Middle East and the Palestinian Territories, and Israel was part of that, and I asked, why don't we produce more, because so much is going on there, I was told that it's very difficult to produce anything because we're criticised for being too pro-Palestinian, and we're criticised by being too pro-Israeli. So I think it's so important to do what you're doing, because for every letter that we're writing, British Zionists are writing 4 letters every time there's an article explaining about deaths and killings in Israel or Palestine. So my question really is that what are the key success stories that really keep you going? Because a lot of people who write either to the media or to MPs give up after a while because they feel they're not making a difference or they're not being listened to. So do you have some sort of key success stories that have motivated you to continue writing?
Yeah, that's what you said is really interesting actually. And if I could ask you a question. So were you working for a programme or
I was working for BBC Monitoring.
Oh,
So
okay.
we were getting monitoring what was going around in the Middle East and deciding what to use for articles online and so on. And like I said, I was surprised at how much little they wanted to put forward. And actually, when I suggested going out to Israel and the Palestinian Territories, they said I couldn't go, so I left and went out independently. But yes, they basically said that you have to not produce much because we will be criticised. That was the line they said to me.
Yeah, I think sort of like fear of complaints rules at BBC over this. And like Jackie Rowland, she now works for Al Jazeera, she used to work for BBC. and I went to a talk she gave, and she said 85% of all the complaints the BBC gets about its entire output, 85% of those are from Zionists complaining about its Israel-Palestine output. So that kind of, puts it in perspective. So we have to be there with our voice as well. Otherwise, it would, it'd just be a hole that the Zionists are filling. Key complaints, just off the top of my head, that we've won. We had one upheld on accuracy when it was during the Rachel Corrie trial last year, and on the World at One, Martha Kearney, the presenter, she was interviewing Mark Regev, and she said, "Oh, I know that on the day Rachel Corrie was killed, Israeli soldiers were killed in Gaza as well," making it sound as if there'd been some kind of standoff between the two, and hadn't been an unarmed civilian standing in front of a house, but there'd been some kind of, fight, and must have involved weapons if these Israeli soldiers were killed. It was an absolute lie, no Israeli soldiers were killed. So we complained about that, and it takes months. It can take between 6 and 8 months to get to the trust. You have to go through a lot of correspondence, but we won it, and then they have to print the corrections. People know it wasn't true. On Newsnight, Jeremy Paxman, he